This podcast is amazing. I know you will enjoy it. As always, it is sponsored by my boys and girls at Ancestral Supplements. They are making incredible grass-fed organ meats, bone marrow from New Zealand. And this week I want to tell you about bovine tracheal cartilage. It wasn't even something that I was aware of until they told me about it. And it's pretty darn cool. So they make this bovine tracheal cartilage sourced from New Zealand. It's a grass-fed animal. And they got interested in it because of the life work of a guy named Dr. John Prudden, Prudden. And you can look him up, and there are published studies detailing his work. So in the life work of John Prudden, it was illustrated that bovine tracheal cartilage had unique and powerful effects on wound healing. He was a surgeon. It also affected immune conditions, joint health, other conditions that were considered to be treatment resistant at the time. And that is a fascinating thing. Perhaps this bovine tracheal cartilage has immunoregulators, trophic factors that we're not aware of. But according to Dr. Prudden, bone cartilage closely resembles fetal mesenchyme, which is the primordial tissue from which muscle, bone, tendons, ligaments, skin, fat, and bone marrow all develop. And there is apparently something really cool here. So I have been taking bovine tracheal cartilage. I really like it. It does provide concentrated amounts of connective tissue, immunoregulators, cartilage building blocks, and perhaps some trophic factors that we're not aware of. This kind of goes back to a fascinating concept. As we're eating the animal nose to tail, many of these things have not been studied. We don't even know what's in there, and this one appears to be a winner. So check out the bovine tracheal cartilage from Ancestral Supplements. Check out the work of John F. Prudden. It's quite fascinating and something I want to dig into more in the future. If he were alive, I would have him on the podcast. And visit ancestralsupplements.com to get all that stuff. If you use the code SALADINOMD, you can get 10% off at their Shopify site. They are putting back in what the modern world has left out. So if you appreciate this podcast, please leave me a review on iTunes. It is doing so good. Usually every week it gets in the top 10 in health and fitness, which is awesome. And we are crushing it. It just grows every week. Share it with people you appreciate. Leave me a review on iTunes and check out my stuff. If you want to find me, you know I can always be found at carnivoremd.com. Without further ado, Dave and Siobhan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having us.
Welcome back, my friend Dave, and welcome to the show, Siobhan, because it's the first time for that one. So we are here at Low Carb San Diego. This is now my hometown. It's pretty good to call it my hometown.
I think so. I think I'm hearing a lot of stories about you surfing lately.
That's all I do. Well, not all I do, seriously, but I'm clear seriously. But I mean, people will watch the video and see that I'm sitting here in flip flops, and I'm really in the surfer vibe.
And a little bit darker. I can tell.
I could be. I try to get that ultraviolet light. We can talk. Maybe we'll talk about that at some point today. But so you're here doing something pretty cool, Dave. You're doing some blood testing, and I'm going to do an episode in the next couple of weeks where I do where I talk about blood work. But I thought this might be a little teaser. I would love to hear about the blood testing that you're doing at the conference and which labs are in this and why you're doing these labs.
Well, so a few things kind of wrapped together. We originally were going to do an experiment that was going to be basically the Feldman Protocol and effectively have a lot of people who came on the Thursday morning that the conference started would get their blood drawn and then basically feast through the conference and see if a second blood draw that would take place Sunday morning would show the effect, actually observe that generally speaking, we'd see a drop in LDL-C. Now, there were some technical issues with that and trying to get the planning done, but we still had a lot of reason to say, let's go ahead and still at least get a broad-based sampling because it's just never been done before, as far as I know, at a low-carb conference to just go ahead and see if not only could we get some good data, but also have that as a way that people could get data for themselves. So it's great because there are a lot of people who we have that come to Cholesterol Code that say, I'd like to see my insulin, but my doctor won't ever order it. And internationally, some of these tests are just not available at all. And so we wanted to make a lot of these tests available, which we were pretty excited about.
That's awesome. So the original goal was to do blood tests at the beginning, the Feldman Protocol, and then blood tests again.
That's right.
And tell people what you were hoping to have. What was the Feldman Protocol in the beginning? Like, what was the Feldman Protocol you wanted people to do in the interim? What does that consist of?
The Feldman Protocol, I mean, basically, it was one of the very first things that I did going on a low-carb diet when I was trying to see how much my lipid numbers would change based on my metabolism, particularly based on my dietary fat. So if I ate a lot of fat, how much would it alter my lipid numbers? And to my surprise, initially, it actually dropped them by a lot. And after doing that, I then started replicating, making it go up and down. For example, if I brought down my dietary fat, I would see my cholesterol go up again. And I eventually, probably the first significant turn was when I got my sister involved, who has much lower levels of LDL cholesterol than I do. And we did a tandem experiment where basically we did it at the same time. And it was identical. We ate exactly the same things at the same time. And hers went up and down in magnitude with mine. And then eventually, after I did a public presentation of it, a lot of people said, hey, could you do like a write-up and, tell us how we could make this happen? And I did so with the usual caveat, this isn't medical advice, use at your own risk, etc. But hey, here's what I did. And now a lot of people have replicated it. But we're kind of interested in having people replicate it in a controlled fashion. So it's a little bit more like a formal experiment. And we've done that once at Keto Fest, and it was the Cholesterol Keto Fest experiment about a couple years ago, but it was a smaller number of people. I want to say maybe a couple dozen. And this time around, we might have gotten a lot more. Had we had the experiment in place, we would have probably had, at this particular conference, we've gotten at least 62 people that have tested. And had we had a little more lead time, we think we might have even gotten it up to 100. But that's basically the gist of what the protocol is, even as anti-intuitive as it is, because I'm sure you've read many times in the literature that in order to bring down your cholesterol, you want to bring down your saturated fat. But at least in the short term, we find that it works inversely with that. You may in fact have a higher baseline of LDL cholesterol if you're powered by fat. But surprisingly, if you consume a lot of fat, particularly a few days before your blood test, we typically see that there's a drop.
Does the context matter? Ketogenic versus carbohydrate-based metabolism?
I absolutely think it does. And it's certainly central to my research. I think if you're powered by carbs, then of course you're powered by glucose. If you're powered by glucose, there's less of a need for, say, carrier proteins. If you're powered by fat, however, there is much more of a need for carrier proteins, probably the most famous carrier protein being lipoproteins, which is kind of like a boat that your body makes to carry around the storage form of fatty acids known as triglycerides.
So a simplified version of the hypothesis would be that, especially in the setting of a ketogenic physiology, though the baseline might be different between different people, the more fat you're eating, the lower your LDL would be in the short term, or the lower the total cholesterol would be in the short term.
In the short term. But there's a little bit more to unpack as to the reason why, and you may just want to go ahead and direct them to like one of the videos where I sort of break down the chylomicron versus VLDL axes as to why it is that consuming a lot of fat would actually drive down the lipoproteins that ultimately remodel to LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol.
Is there a good video on Cholesterol Code or YouTube you would point people to for that?
Yeah, if people just go to cholesterolcode.com right now, there's a sort of start here section at the very beginning. And I believe we have it as one of the quick links. Or people probably could check out my Breckenridge talk, just like Dave Feldman, Breckenridge 2018. And in that one, I actually kind of have a little more of a cartoonized version. It's really holds people's hands, taking them through the energy model.
Cool. So what were the labs that you were going to get here? Because I think this is a cool list of blood work that you had people getting, and I'm fascinated by this. So tell me which blood tests were on this panel, and then let's walk through what each of those blood tests means.
Well, and actually for that, I'm gonna list off these blood tests, and I'm actually going to hand this off to Siobhan, because you may have noticed there's a number of tests on here that especially relate to inflammation. So we have C-Peptide, which of course is often taken with insulin, both of which I consider to be very important tests. A CBC, which is fairly standard, as is comprehensive metabolic panel. There's sort of a broad-based, wide net kind of thing. C-reactive protein, which is one of our favorites. It's one of the best inflammatory markers, but to be sure, it can also be high for good and bad reasons. And this is one that I liked a lot, is free fatty acids. You almost never see this in a panel. And this is one we've wanted to see, particularly in low carbers, because we believe that they're trafficking more free fatty acids in particular. Ferritin and GGT, I'm going to leave for Siobhan, but glucagon, I'm especially interested in it because, as you know, it's the hormone that's often counterbalancing insulin in many respects, but it can be elevated for bad reasons. And we're interested to see how it plays out in that case with many other people. And HbA1c, of course, most people already know as an indicator for type 2 diabetes, or for that matter, even pre-diabetes. And of course, a basic lipid panel, which we like to have, and that, of course, will get us the lipids and the infamous Lp(a).
The big bad, the supervillain.
Right. And
so we were told.
And so I'm going to actually hand this off to Siobhan to talk a little bit about the inflammatory markers.
Right. So I have my kind of triad. Dave has his triad. I have mine. And this
I didn't know there were two triads. All right, cool.
So the triad I typically look at for inflammation is HSCRP, ferritin, and lipoprotein(a). And the reason I look at those is because they're all something called acute phase reactants, which means that when inflammation is high, they'll go up in response. So that's something I was pretty interested to look at in regards to low carbers in general, just to see, like, how are they doing? And there is a downside. I mean, it could be considered an upside as well to CRP, in that it is very sensitive. So if a person had, say, gone on a run along the beach the day before the blood test, their HSCRP might be elevated. But generally, if it is low, it's a pretty good sign that things are kind of at a steady state where everything is going pretty good.
What's your sense of the half-life of HSCRP? Do we know that? Because I've seen this in some of my clients, and I know you've done a bunch of testing, Dave, on your HSCRP. When I have people check HSCRP, I always say, don't you dare work out before you get your blood drawn. But should people be worried about working out the night before or the day before? I mean, what are we looking at here?
I have very distinct data that you should be very interested in, which is during the phase in which I was doing distance running, I had the presence of mind, and once again, my wife is so wonderful for putting up with this, that the morning after I went to a LabCorp, I would have actually done it immediately following the half marathon or marathon that I would run, except that LabCorps aren't typically open on a Sunday. But 24 hours afterwards, I would get my blood panel done, which included a HSCRP. And the highest CRPs I've ever had were in there. And I'm not sure if I've even told you what they were before.
I think I've heard some of these numbers, like in the 50s.
Yeah, one was 52, the highest one I had ever had. And bear in mind that most of the time, most of my blood panels are at 1 or under through all of my markers. And I want to say that I've had now probably close to maybe 80 HSCRP tests. And only during that period of time where I was training do I have numbers that have climbed anywhere, I want to say, between 7 and that number. Basically, 52 was the highest. The time after the full marathon, I had a 38. And outside of that, it was no lower than a 7 when it was the day following a half marathon. Now, certainly, as you know, much of working out, particularly when you do something like distance running, is you're fully aware that you are going to be inflaming yourself. That's actually just part of the process. And this is what's kind of good and bad about CRP. It's picking up inflammation in whatever form it comes in. But to answer your question on the half-life, obviously, I think it's going to be higher for a substantial reason. The one time I had a CRP that was 2 days after a half marathon, even then it was 13.4. So I do think that, let me actually bring it back just a step further. We don't really know that much on the half-life in this regard because, of course, it's not acute and only in that moment. It could be that it's still part of the ongoing process. How much did I have asymptomatic issues that were still being worked on by my body a couple days later? We can't say we know for sure.
I actually have an interesting tidbit for CRP as well from recent lab work I had done. It was actually at the tail end of a high-fat carnivore experiment, so it was a bit disappointing at the same time. But I had actually gotten a sunburn 2 or 3 days prior, and it showed up in the CRP and ferritin, and I believe even lipoprotein(a) were all elevated.
How much were they elevated above baseline? Any sense of the percentage?
I don't remember the exact amount. I think ferritin might have doubled or tripled from my usual. And then HSCRP was somewhere above 3, and normally for me it's like 0.4. So significantly.
Your ferritin doubled or tripled?
So my ferritin is actually normally around like 30 or 40, so that's not like as insane as it sounds. But yeah, it will go up pretty high.
And ferritin is a measure that I see on a lot of patients' panels. People get worried about it because there's variability in the range reported by the labs. True Health Diagnostics is a lab that I use a lot, and they have a very low cutoff for ferritin. But I think about ferritin in the context of HSCRP, and I like what you guys are doing here. I'm trying to triangulate among all the inflammatory markers and see if there's something raising all of them. Dave is smiling.
Yeah, funny you should talk about ferritin.
Let's talk about ferritin.
So after I started a ketogenic diet, I did a ferritin test and found out that mine was in the 500s. That concerned me a bit because that was well above the reference range that I believe on the test listed it around, I want to say 300. And over time, there were points where it bounced around between 500s and 700s. But very interestingly, the one time I did a multi-day fast, it had gone into the 900s. The only time it had gotten that high.
How long was the fast?
The fast was 2.5 days. And Siobhan, of course, will say that was also the highest that you'd had yours, right? So here's where it gets interesting. And it may be anecdotal in nature, but what happened is my ferritin eventually crept down to closer into the 200s and is currently that way today. And I don't know for sure if this is what it was, but it seemed to happen around the time that I corrected my electrolyte issues, which, as you know, we both talked about quite a bit. Basically, I consume way more salt than I did before, and occasionally I supplement with sports salts, which is an electrolyte supplement. So ferritin I found to be pretty interesting, and for the longest time I didn't know if it was keto that ultimately brought my ferritin up. But guess what? I found an old lab that I want to say was from 2014 that happened to test my ferritin, and it was in the 500s then too.
So it was high based on the lab range even before keto.
That's right.
And you're saying that you've had a ferritin as high as 900 and as low as 200 with no phlebotomy in between. You lowered your ferritin from 900 to 200 with no phlebotomy or anything else.
Well, to be fair,
I guess that's true. You do a lot of blood draws on yourself.
I do a lot of blood draws. Now, here's the thing. I did actually do one experiment. I never actually wrote about it, but I did one experiment where I took my blood and did a blood donation and then took my blood again a few days later to see if it affected my ferritin appreciably, and it didn't seem to.
What people may be asking now is, what is ferritin? And as we mentioned earlier, ferritin is an acute phase reactant. It may elevate in the setting of acute inflammation, but we also think about ferritin as a storage form of iron. Iron panels are quite complex. If you look at iron panels, you'll have serum iron, TIBC, which is total iron binding capacity. You'll have, sometimes you'll have other measures of iron status. You'll have iron saturation or transferrin saturation, and you can have ferritin. So interpretation of iron panels is fairly complex. Ferritin is often thought of as an iron storage, but as Siobhan and Dave are pointing out, it's also an acute phase reactant and has to be interpreted in that context. And so an elevated ferritin may not actually mean that you have too much iron. The reason we get worried about an elevated ferritin is in some contexts because we worry about too much iron. There are conditions like hemochromatosis that are associated with excess iron storage, and that can lead to oxidative stress in the liver, in other parts of the body, in the pancreas, et cetera, et cetera. But generally speaking, we can interpret this in the context of all the other measures. But that's interesting, Dave, that you have changed it so much. Did you have other thoughts on ferritin, Siobhan?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to make a quick correction. My highest wasn't actually during a fast. I had done a 7-day fast for an experiment, and it had gone up during that time, as well as lipoprotein(a), actually. It was probably highest when I got a blood draw when I was sick. So this is a habit of mine. Whenever I get sick, I'll go in for blood work to collect sick data. And there was one point where I was sick enough that I had a fever, and that was probably where ferritin was highest. And it's also my highest recorded HSCRP. It was at 48.
48. Yeah.
And then I actually tested again, I think 2 weeks later. And at that point, Lp(a) was at my highest at 180.
nanomole per liter.
Yeah.
We're going to talk all about LP little a later on today.
Yeah. And then HSCRP had actually dropped off at that point, I think below 1 or 3 or something like that.
Interesting.
Quite a bit lower. And ferritin had also dropped down as well.
So those are the inflammatory markers. Let's just run people through the other stuff on there, because I think there's some nuance in some of these other markers that you're getting testing, and I'd like to just briefly talk about those before we move on to some new and exciting stuff from Dave.
Yeah. So the GGT is generally looked at in regards to liver damage.
Oxidative stress. GGT is gamma glutamyl transferase. Probably correlates with the body making more glutathione.
Right. Lipid panel, kind of known by one and all. HDL, LDL, triglycerides, and total cholesterol is what's contained in there.
In milligrams per deciliter.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Glucagon is actually an interesting one that Dave has done a lot of testing with, and I've kind of picked up recently. I'm sure he can tell you about all the extensive changes he has seen with it.
Do you want to talk a little about glucagon, Dave?
Well, yeah, of course, I was impacted quite a bit by Ben Bickman's great talk, I believe from last year at Breckenridge, the glucagon insulin index. And really just some eye-opening stuff that he has in that. And from that point, I started deciding to add glucagon, even though it's really expensive. But once I added it to my labs, I wanted to see, really how much it would work inversely with insulin, which I figured there would be some inverse correlation. To my surprise, at least with me personally, I haven't actually seen quite a lot of movement. Mine's usually, I forget their exact measurements, but mine's usually in the upper 60s to maybe low mid 70s. And that said, I did start slipping in the glucagon test with some of my friends and family. And one of my challenge cases, as it turns out, had very high glucagon along with very high insulin, which isn't too uncommon for somebody in his particular situation. Siobhan has actually already done, I want to say 3 or 4, right?
Probably like 4 or 5.
4 or 5, but she's actually observed some swings, unlike to a degree much bigger than mine.
And I actually have someone who sent me their labs. It was actually someone who is diabetic. And she had decided to get baseline labs done, including glucagon, and followed up with a carnivorous, high-fat elimination diet, and followed up after a month. And her glucagon had actually gone from around 100 down to, I think, 56 in that time. And other markers had also improved. But interestingly, her insulin had stayed the same. And she did give me permission to share that information wherever.
What was her insulin throughout the test? Do you have a sense?
20.
20 throughout it, huh? Which we would think of as a high fasting insulin.
Yes, definitely.
Let's explain to people just a little bit about glucagon and what it does in case they're not familiar with that.
Well, of course, glucagon helps to activate more lipolysis, and thus the release of the free fatty acids from adipocytes. So your adipocytes are your fat cells, and effectively what's happening on a constant endless basis is actually energy's being parked in them, and then over time they're being released. They're kind of like a large number of mini gas tanks all around your body. And for the most part, they're either in one of two states. For the most part, they're either being filled, so insulin's higher, and it's now time to shuttle energy into them, in which case things are coming in, or it's time to release, which is typically during the fasted state, and they're slowly releasing non-esterified fatty acids, as they're known in the literature. And glucagon is part of the signal to say, go ahead and release. Whereas insulin is, of course, part of the, hey, don't release. In fact, if anything, take up.
And interestingly, it does look as though glucagon has an immunological role as well. There's actually a really excellent paper on ureagenesis, gluconeogenesis, and ketogenesis during sepsis. And they make a point to note that during sepsis, which is essentially like end-game infection, what they find is people will have high insulin or insulin resistance as well as high glucagon. And this is actually something we're seeing in diabetics as well from the few points we have so far.
Interesting. Okay, so in the labs that you are doing here, would you expect free fatty acids in the blood or non-esterified fatty acids to correlate with glucagon?
I'm not sure about glucagon because the piece of the puzzle I haven't, well, I guess I did kind of allude to it a little bit. It doesn't, for me, when I ran regressions against it, I didn't actually find a strong correlation, including inverse correlation, which I was expecting.
On your data?
On my data.
Between non-esterified or free fatty acids and glucagon levels?
Well, between glucagon and insulin.
Oh, okay.
And I'm skeptical as to whether there'll be a strong inverse relationship with free fatty acids because I do find that there's a correlation with insulin and free fatty acids, rather a reverse relationship with fasted insulin and free fatty acids.
Meaning that the lower someone's fasting insulin is, the higher you'd expect their free fatty acids to be?
Yes.
And do you think that's because the body's mobilizing the free fatty acids?
I do. Now, to be sure, there's, of course, a pathological state in which you would have high free fatty acids and high insulin. So once again, a lot of this research is to emphasize that there is a difference between the two, even if they're not mutually exclusive, but that there could be a circumstance for which you have high free fatty acids and it's not a bad thing.
Correct. So I would actually expect to see someone with high insulin and high free fatty acids if they're sick or recently injured, basically anything involving inflammation and inflammation being needed. And this is probably partially because inflammation or oxidative stress, all that type of stuff, can induce insulin resistance in the adipose and in the liver. And I think this is actually something you have some interest in that insulin resistance can precede hyperinsulinemia. So the insulin resistance can come first.
Yeah, the causes of insulin resistance are incredibly fascinating, and how it's all linked is quite interesting. So that is an interesting correlation, that if we see high free fatty acids and high insulin, we're essentially in an insulin resistant state. And high insulin, what do you use as a cutoff for high insulin?
So
fasting insulin.
Yeah, high fasting insulin, I would consider over 10 is immediately like, let's take a closer look at your lifestyle. And then ideally, I would prefer mine just personally under 5.
And I see most of the people I work with have fasting insulins that are under 5. A lot of them are under 3 in people on ketogenic and carnivore diets. And even people who are not necessarily on ketogenic or carnivore diets, I've seen very low fasting insulins. I think it's quite an interesting measure. So you guys have that on there. You also have a C-Peptide on this blood work. So tell me about the C-Peptide, because C-Peptide is a fragment of insulin. How do you use the C-Peptide to strengthen your data set here?
Well, to be sure, and I wish I had a little more of my physiology available, but basically C-Peptide is, and I'm just going to say this. I know this much about C-Peptide, that of course it has a longer time horizon. It has a longer half-life than insulin. Insulin is a little more pulsatile. And so in that regard, I like C-Peptide because it tends to correlate with insulin, but it has a little more reliability against insulin of what I've read. Now, that said, as you know, I like to go get my data. So I don't want to speak too much to its reliability until I've done enough of my own tests to find out. But thus far, it does in fact seem to be very stable. And it does seem to match the expectations of the experiments that I have when I'm doing them. So when it's really elevated, it's usually elevated in the context I would expect it to. For example, in my white bread and processed meat experiment, it was super, super high. And that was expected. C-Peptide was, yes.
Yep. Yeah, so basically if people are getting a C-Peptide, they would want that to be low as well as insulin, generally speaking.
Yes, that's certainly my opinion. Well, look, bottom line is this. I don't care what diet you're on. If after 12 hours of fasting, having only water, your insulin and or your C-Peptide is high, I would consider that a serious concern.
It would certainly raise yellow, red flags for me.
Yeah.
Red flags.
Now, to be sure, and of course, Siobhan can speak to this as well, if you've already got symptoms of being sick, maybe I wouldn't be as concerned about it. If you don't have symptoms of being sick, I want to look for the asymptomatic sickness that may be involved. That's why we like inflammatory. Inflammatory markers are great for just detecting that there's a problem, not because they're the problem, but as Siobhan was mentioning, because they're the response to the problem.
So if somebody is not acutely ill with a fever, a cold, a viral illness, hasn't run a marathon or a half marathon the day before, hasn't had an intense workout in the last 24 hours, and inflammatory markers and or insulin, glucagon, C-Peptide are abnormal, then we might be looking at one of these sort of occult issues that raise the flags and let us think, why is your metabolism deranged? Does that sound good?
Yes. Well, let me take it a step further. All those things you just mentioned, try not to have happening before you take your blood test.
Right.
Per what you just said. So you want to have a run-in to where your blood test makes a little more sense for you.
Yeah, I just also wanted to add, in addition to those, any cause where inflammation is acutely necessary. So broken a leg, don't expect your lab results to be representative because it's just not going to be.
And you guys also have on there hemoglobin A1C.
Yep.
People are pretty familiar with this one, but if they're not, I would think of hemoglobin A1C as a 90-day average of blood sugar. Is that how you guys think of it?
Because I take high-frequency tests, just as I just mentioned, I like to go get my own data. I find I can move it by, I want to say, 0.2, 0.3 over the course of a few days.
Wow.
So, of course, it's glycated hemoglobin, and the glycation is supposed to be a mean average. But I've seen, I think my record right now is in 3 days, it had been 5.6 and had gone to 6.0 at one point.
And how did you do that?
That was actually, I think, the Skittles experiment. It was the first of the added sugar experiments.
So I guess what David's referring to here is that there's something about hemoglobin A1C that could move more quickly than a 90-day moving average.
And because, it could be the error rate, to be sure.
Yeah.
But the point is, are you making a medical decision based on something that's within the error rate, if it is that, or for that matter, before you've detected how much it can change?
You know, I hope that in the future, people will be able to get more blood work, because one of the things that I'm seeing is that one blood test every 3 months is inadequate. And if I see one blood test and everything looks great, which is a very blanket statement, maybe I shouldn't believe that. I should probably retest that in a few weeks to make sure. But if I see a blood test which is more common and something's a little off, I often think, well, just repeat it next week. And some of the best data that I've gotten is when I can get blood work on a client or a patient every week for a month. And then we have multiple data points.
Right. Look, there's just no getting around it. If there's anything you could see by looking just at 1% of the data that I've been accumulating, it's that you cannot look at any test in isolation, whether it's good or it's bad. You want to be aware of the context of the prior tests. And the more that you're aware of that context, the more you can start getting a sense of it. So I would say this to medical professionals as well. Please don't get that one test and then look at the reference ranges and not look at it in the context of it. That's why I like it when it shows in a spreadsheet form and you can at least look at different trends, because in many respects, those trends can say a lot about what's coming. And I think so much of that is relevant to healthcare, is you want to be able to spot these things in advance of them happening.
It's patterning. It's stock markets. It's financial markets. We need multiple data points. We can't just look at it one point in time. It's crazy to do this. I don't know why this is the way our medical system functions, other than the fact that insurance doesn't want to pay for it all the time, which I think leads to bad care in many conditions. We're making decisions based on one point in time. Could be going up, could be going down. As you mentioned with insulin, it can vary even throughout the day. Maybe C-peptide is more stable, glucose. It's an interesting thing. And I like what you're saying there, and I completely agree with you. I love having multiple tests to triangulate what's going on. I like having multiple inflammatory markers. I like having multiple markers of insulin sensitivity. We got to have that, because if one of them doesn't make sense, then I can understand it. If ferritin is super high, but all the other inflammatory markers are low, I'm thinking, what's going on here?
That's exactly right.
Maybe I do need to test for hemochromatosis.
That's right. But more so, like, if you are in a challenge state, because I get this a lot. People go, well, I'm not going to be a you. Dave, I can't be a Dave Feldman. I can't, test every week, blah, blah, blah. But like the challenge cases in my family, like I would like you to at least get one every quarter. I'd like you to get a test every quarter, because I think it's also important to you to see the data reflected back to you on the progress you're making. But regardless, if you're in a challenge state, if you're in a situation, you and your doctor need to be more aware of what's happening in an ongoing basis and at a higher frequency. I think it's almost dangerous to just be testing one time a year.
I totally agree. I think that in the situation where people are sick, like you say, challenged, we should be testing every 2 weeks, every week for a couple of months, just to really see what's going on.
I would agree. And I have found in people that I know of people who are only testing once a year, every 6 months or something. I do know someone with diabetes, for example, who was doing that. And, there was just no feedback until the next year of what they were doing. And they just lost motivation because it's like, well, I'm not losing weight, so clearly this isn't working. And what ended up changing things for them was they got a continuous glucose monitor. And it was just immediate feedback of any time they ate, this is what it's doing to my blood sugar. And now they're low carb because of that, because they saw the results and they are getting better.
So powerful. It's so powerful. I think the CGMs are the first.
They're a game changer.
They are a game changer. And I think we need to use that model and scale it to make CGM easier, to do other tests in real time, insulin, CRP, et cetera. Like that would be fantastic for people. I think that would really change the equation, but it's great that CGMs are getting better. So before we leave the blood work, I think we should just touch a little bit on the lipid panel, because we were talking about this before the podcast, as we often do. We always geek out before the podcast. And you guys we were talking about triglycerides, and I think triglycerides are fascinating. So let's just go into triglycerides a little bit for people and talk about triglycerides and why you feel like that's such an important measure. Because people have heard LDL, and we've talked about LDL a ton on previous podcasts, and I've talked to Nadir Ali about LDL. We'll talk about LDL a little bit, and we're going to talk about total cholesterol and the setting of the NHANES data in a second. But let's talk about triglycerides and why this is probably where the money is.
Sure. Well, first of all, triglycerides, to be distinctive, is the cargo that's typically found in the lipoproteins themselves, the boats we were talking about before. And getting back to the context, if you're fasted 12 hours, I would expect your triglycerides to be low. Why? Because for the same reason, I would expect your glucose to be low. They're both an energy substrate. And if your body's working properly, there shouldn't really be a lot of energy parked in your bloodstream. Usually that's something we would expect if you've just consumed food. But now that you fasted for a period of time, that should have all been put away. And so now you should have a clean freeway, if you will, where there's not really a lot of energy left over.
Moving throughout the body.
Correct. Now, to be sure, the people who we see that have very high LDL that we're especially interested in, some of those who have the highest LDL will have the lowest triglycerides. And of course, if you look at the existing data, you find that there really is an association with triglycerides, not just with all-cause mortality, but with cardiovascular disease in particular. In other words, the higher your triglycerides, the more at risk you are. Ourselves, we kind of like to have it at typically under 100. It's a little more in the yellow zone if your triglycerides are 100 to say 150. And we get definitely a bit more concerned if your triglycerides are above 150. And there's a lot of data to back that up for the most part. But what it tends to associate with, if you have very high triglycerides, is it associates with more of what's known as VLDL, which is that precursor to LDL. So that so-called bad cholesterol, that's the other cargo that's in a lipoprotein. And LDL are those. The VLDLs are the ones that usually have the most triglycerides when they're coming from storage as far as lipoproteins, and they eventually can remodel to LDL.
So people, I think, will benefit from understanding this piece of the equation. Triglycerides don't move in the blood in a naked fashion, do they?
Correct.
They're on boats.
They require a carrier protein. They're like oil and water. It's exactly the same chemical reaction with fatty acids in your blood. They're not water soluble.
So the triglycerides are moving on a variety of boats. They're moving on chylomicrons. They're moving on VLDL, which gets remodeled into IDL and LDL, right?
Right.
Okay. So when we see a high level of triglycerides on a lipid panel, what we are seeing is that there are lots of boats, lots of lipoprotein particles carrying triglycerides for some reason. That's what we're looking at.
Correct. And in my opinion, there's one of two explanations for them. And again, they're not mutually exclusive. I believe that the most common explanation will turn out that you're in a metabolically deranged state. In other words, there's a very decent chance that the boats are hanging out in the harbor because they've got nowhere to go. They've got nowhere to park that energy. So there's not a lot of places for where they can put it. Typically where they're taking it is to adipocytes, especially to constantly redistribute the energy. And unfortunately, if there's not a lot of uptake by the adipocytes for many different reasons, which we'll get into, But if there's not a lot, then they need to start putting it somewhere else. And that's where you get the buildup of what's known as ectopic fat. Ectopic fat is basically, to summarize, putting energy, specifically fat, into tissues that were not designed to hold it. Such as
like xanthelasma, xanthomas, things like this. Yes.
These are not just that, but also like organs, like the liver, the pancreas, even the heart. Okay. There's many different places where it can get, I guess you could say, stashed. But unfortunately, that is highly correlated with the disease state, and you're definitely in a metabolically inflexible position after that.
So how are triglycerides different than free fatty acids?
Okay, so triglycerides, as I mentioned earlier, are like the storage form of fat. The way you can think of them is they're kind of like a big, bulky package. And because of that, they stay within the carrier protein, the boat. They stay on board. And it's triglycerides means there's three. It's three fatty acids with a glycerol backbone. And what happens, this is kind of neat, when they get bound to a cell that wants to make use of them, they bind to the boat. It's almost like it docks. Then there's a process that gets started with something known as lipoprotein lipase that will actually de-esterify, that is to say it breaks apart those long-chain fatty acids so that they start coming apart and loose, and then they can start coming through the membrane of the lipoprotein and then further through the membrane of the cell. And I'm kind of simplifying it somewhat, but basically that's the way in which it can get a lot of these fatty acids into the cell. As that happens, some will actually spill out into the bloodstream. And those free fatty acids that are found in the bloodstream, they will bind to another carrier protein known as albumin. Albumin has, I want to say, something in the neighborhood of like 7 to 14 sites of binding where it can bind, and it carries a number of different things. It's actually, I believe, the most prominent protein in your bloodstream. But that's not the only way in which these fatty acids can end up in your bloodstream. The most prominent way is what we were talking about before, which is known as lipolysis, which is a natural and ongoing process where your fat cells release fatty acids into your bloodstream.
So in that situation, free fatty acids, non-esterified fatty acids, can travel in the bloodstream without a carrier. Well, they're always traveling on albumin.
Correct.
They're not traveling naked.
No, they can travel naked for an extremely short distance, but again, like oil and water, they'll clump it together, they'll kind of move off to the side and so forth. But like, let's say there's a neighboring tissue that makes use of, for example, many free fatty acids are released from adipocytes that never see the bloodstream. They'll either be re-esterified into a different adipocyte or into, say, a non-adipocyte cell, such as muscle tissue, for example.
Okay. Let's walk people through, what if we could make this magical, maybe hopefully not too magical in the future, device to measure triglycerides in real time? Because what I want to help people understand is the level of triglycerides that you might find in the blood between eating a meal and then let's say 12 to 14 hours later, which is when you'd want to get a fasted lipid panel. And we'll talk about this triglyceride carryover effect. What would happen to my triglycerides in the blood if I had just eaten a big carnivore meal, for instance? Like, let's walk people through, like, what are the triglycerides looking like in real time?
Sure. Well, and this is, even though I'm going to talk through a lot of steps, this is still a little bit simplified. But literally the fat you just ate, it's going to be...
There's going to be a lot of it because I love suet.
There's going to be a lot of it.
I just ate a lot of suet.
There's going to be enzymes that break it down in your stomach and then ultimately into your small intestine. And along your small intestine are something known as enterocytes. Those enterocytes, part of their job is to ultimately bring them in. And I don't have the diagram in front of me, but there's the Niemann-Pick process that actually helps to shuttle them into...
The transporter.
Right, the transporter. And it's there that it'll actually start getting packaged up into a chylomicron, which actually goes into the lymph. In from the lymph, it'll eventually make its way to the, I always mess this up, the thoracic duct, is that what it is?
Thoracic duct,
Thoracic duct, where, interestingly, it goes especially first to the heart. The heart gets, as they would say, first dibs.
On the fat.
Yeah, absolutely. Which makes sense because, and you probably already know this, the cardiac muscle tissue and skeletal muscle tissue prefer fatty acids, specifically fatty acids over all the other substrates. And so once it gets it, if it can get additional fatty acids, that's where it can get a lot of it. But that also is potentially a point of vulnerability for toxins and other different things like reactive oxygen species that come through too. There's a lot of interesting research on that as to why it may be also a reason for cardiovascular disease entry points being a little bit earlier from that direction. But anyway, these chylomicrons, as they come in, they're much larger than VLDLs. They're massive. They're like, and actually when I say massive, I should still give some perspective. I want to say, and I'm speaking a little bit from memory here, I want to say they're 1,200 nanometers. But even so, a capillary at its smallest is maybe 50 microns. So even though I say they're massive, they're still actually teeny tiny relative to your smallest of blood vessels, right? But that said, compared to other lipoproteins, they're massive. They have a whole lot of triglycerides on board, and they very, very quickly start dropping them off. And chylomicrons, unlike VLDLs, the ones we were talking about earlier, they actually get cleared by the liver relatively quickly, unless you have some kind of disease that keeps them in play. They drop off their triglycerides, they get absorbed. And per the inversion pattern, they're in a constant, and per the research, they seem to be in a constant counterbalance with your VLDL because your body is basically determining how much it needs to make energy available in counterbalance to what you're bringing in. So if you're powered only by fat and you're eating a lot of fat and that's coming in as a lot of chylomicrons, I would bet that you're not going to have a lot of VLDLs released by your body over time. It's going to say, oh, we don't need to. We're already in a state of abundance. But you change gears, you fast instead, then there's going to be more lipolysis, releasing more fatty acids. That's going to ultimately end up in more VLDLs. And those will instead be dropping off the free fatty acids to your tissue, remodeling to LDLs, resulting in you having high LDL particles and high LDL cholesterol.
And so in the short term, I just ate a big meal of suet with maybe a little bit of steak and some liver and other organs that I like to eat. The triglycerides will be quite high in my blood, won't they?
Absolutely will.
If I do postprandial, meaning within an hour or two or three, they're going to be really high.
Absolutely, because you literally, as I just mentioned, installed them into your vascular system.
And we can measure. I mean, we're measuring the total triglycerides. So we're measuring we're measuring the chylomicrons a little bit when we're doing a lipid panel, right? Like
absolutely. Well, hopefully you're not.
Exactly. But if I were to do a lipid panel postprandially, I would see chylomicrons that are 1,200 nanometers carrying a whole bunch of triglycerides from that delicious suet that I ate.
That's correct. In fact, this is one of the common things we address at Cholesterol Code all the time. Is people often having a test, they were told by their doctor, you don't need to be fasted. But particularly if you are low carb, then there's a much higher likelihood that you're going to have very high triglycerides on that panel.
Any utility to non-fasted lipid panels?
It's not that I don't think it's without utility. It's just that it needs to be thought of in that context. I think that you might have more utility being already aware of this context to know how to better understand it. For example, let's say a patient came into you right now and said, Doc, I'm sorry, I'm about to go on vacation for a month. And you're like, but I really want to get your blood panel. You get the blood panel. Paul, know not to look too closely at the lipid panel and hope that the other metabolic markers aren't thrown off by too much. And many of them won't be. Many of them, like the CMP, probably won't be that different.
Do you think that the postprandial triglycerides then would be higher on someone who's eating a high-fat ketogenic diet?
Yes.
So,
100%.
Because every once in a while I have a client who comes to me and they say, Doc, my triglycerides were 350 and my doctor's worried about this. And I say, you're on a ketogenic diet. This isn't a fasted test. Like, I'm not worried about your triglycerides at 350 if they're postprandial, if they're not fasted. It's just that you're moving more of this lipid through your body, moving more of the fat through your body. And this goes back to something that I think you and I have talked about before. Western medical physicians need to be trained more to understand what ketogenic physiology looks like, because it looks very different than carbohydrate-based physiology, right? The postprandial triglycerides of someone eating a carbohydrate-based diet could look very different than someone eating a carnivorous, ketogenic, high-fat diet.
100%. And this is why it's a central focus for us to try to get this out to non-low-carb physicians. That's a challenge, of course. But we have the benefit of many low-carb patients reflecting this data back to the physicians. And now we have a lot of non-low carb physicians reaching out to us to pick up more on this data. So it's getting out there. It's slow. It's getting out there. But at a minimum, we need the low carbers themselves, or those people on a carnivorous diet, to at least know what's happening so that they can know how to better educate the professionals around them.
It's, I was talking to Ken Berry yesterday, and he had some really wise suggestions. I think he's totally right. I think that the patients are going to be the people, the non-physicians, the patients, the people are going to be the ones that move this movement forward and that end up educating their physicians, because there will be this wave of people who are so well educated because of you guys, and people like Ken, and hopefully some of the work that I can do, putting the information in the people, those hands.
Well, and let's call it what it is. We got lucky that it's 2019 and we have the information age all around us, and we have social media, and we have the...
Well,
is that a commonality around here?
I think we're sitting in a hotel, and I think that's a ship outside of the window firing cannons.
Wow. That makes for a good wake-up call.
So it's 2019. We
Yes.
have information.
So we're fortunate right now. That's 2019. We have a lot of information available to us via the internet. And, a lot of people, I've gone to a lot of these conferences with the doctors. I'm sure you have as well. They like to speak of the internet in hushed tones. It's generally a pejorative. And to be sure, there's a lot of wackiness on the internet. So it's not as if everything you get off the internet is pristine positive data, but that's fine so long as everybody can be aware that still good data can emerge, and to best understand if the source is trustworthy. And in that sense, we were very mindful, especially at the site, to try to be as trustworthy as possible in the execution of our experiments and how we handle the information to the degree that we know it exists and to what confidence we have in it.
Now, what are the recommendations around triglycerides? Because I think these are really important for people when they're getting a lipid panel. Let's talk about triglyceride carryover and just give people some really clear recommendations so they know what a valid triglyceride measure is.
Yes. Well, I'm glad you brought up triglyceride carryover, because this especially applies to carnivores. This is basically what happened was near the end of December of last year, I started my Carnivore 1.0 is what I call it. And in the course of doing that, I want to say 10 days in, I took my blood and found that my triglycerides were 240, a number I'd never seen before. And I was quite astonished by it. I thought, wow, this is an extremely... I wonder if something like seriously big happened. Because
I don't know.
Do you know for sure that was like the ship that blew up? That okay, it was like a whole emergency vehicle.
We'll see.
Sorry. All right, let me just restart that piece real quick. Hold on. So basically, this is what happened. I went on my Carnivore 1.0 experiment, which started at the end of December of last year. And about 10 days in, I saw that my triglycerides had hit a record number I'd never seen before, 240 milligrams per deciliter. And because I'm me, I got excited about it. Most people would probably be appalled, but I had my cardio check to have observed it. And I then started ultimately doing hour after hour testing so that I could actually see the numbers slowly going down. And sure enough, at 12 hours fasted, it had moved from 240 to under 100.
When was the 240?
The 240, I want to say, was maybe at 7 or 8 hours fasted. And of course, under 100 was at 100. And
At
again,
12 hours.
At 12 hours. Mm-hmm. And God bless my family, because I said, guys, I'm going to need to really focus on this for the next few days. And it's, by the way, this is the holidays. Like, I only visit them every other year for the holidays in Denver. So I said, I'm sorry, this is kind of a big deal. We have a whole portion of the community that has high triglycerides, doesn't know why. And this is a first, because I've never been able to see this. I was able to recreate it a few more times and worked my way backwards to before when I went to sleep. And sure enough, I found that if I had a steak while being totally carnivore, it's kind of key. While being totally carnivore, I would have postprandial triglycerides of, let's say, 230, 240, 2 hours afterwards. But then I would test again 4 hours afterwards before I went to sleep. So I'd eat at, like, say, 8, and I was going to be going to sleep at midnight. And it was still around 240. So that's why I call it carryover. I'd go to sleep and it carried over my sleep cycle. And I'd wake up in the morning with something elevated, let's say like 140, 180, something up there. But invariably, after 12 hours, almost like magic, it would drop to below 100, sometimes even into the 60s or 70s. But I've had a number of different times where, for example, even at 11 hours fasted, it was still highly elevated. But 100% of the time at 12 hours fasted, it dropped below. Now, certainly there's probably some variation there, but it also doesn't surprise me too much because of those people we know who are faithful about always making sure that they get to 12 hours fasted, they would see that difference.
And interestingly, I had done a test around 9 hours fasted during my carnivore baseline before the high-fat carnivore experiment, and it actually came back normal. But then after I went high-fat carnivore, so in macronutrient grams, it went from 1-to-1 protein to fat to 2-to-1 protein to fat, fat to protein, yeah. And when I tested on the high-fat carnivore at 11 hours, it came back, I think it was around like 119 or something like that. And of course, I immediately checked 1 hour later when I was 12 hours fasted, and it came back at 89.
That's so interesting. And I think that for most of my patients and clients now, I'll have them check at 14 hours just to be safe. And I'll say, do a 14-hour fast. Just get way into that. What else can elevate triglycerides in people, guys? What else do we think about this?
Actually, I'm going to hand it back to her because remember, I brought up the metabolic reason that I think high triglycerides could be problematic, but there's another one.
So first, I actually would like to bring up coffee, and hopefully no one comes for me.
We're in a secure room.
Yes, the door is locked. No one can get in.
We're in a earthquake shelter. We're in a bunker.
So one thing that Dave and I kept seeing every so often is someone would come to us, low carb, keto, carnivore, and they had properly fasted for the test, 12 to 14 hours, water only, and their triglycerides were high. And it was a very specific pattern in that usually when your triglycerides are high, your HDL is lower than, what would be expected.
45 milligrams per deciliter. Yeah.
And for them, their high triglycerides were actually paired with HDL that was normal for them. So 60, sometimes even 70. And we were like, okay, this is kind of weird. And after collecting enough data from people, what we found the commonality is they were habitual coffee drinkers. And to clarify, this doesn't happen to everyone. So it doesn't happen to me. I drink coffee. My trigs are below 100. All good. But for a minority of people, especially carnivores, it seems, if they are habitual coffee drinkers, it will cause this high triglyceride effect. And we actually had someone, his name is Sean, he wrote a post for us after testing this out. He tried filtered coffee, he tried decaf, his usual, French press kind of thing. And whenever he was drinking coffee, his triglycerides were high.
Even with decaf.
Even with decaf.
So it's probably not the caffeine.
Right. And that's what we suspected at first, it's caffeine. But another thing that doesn't really fit with that is we've seen chronic diet soda drinkers. We've seen even people drinking diet energy drinks or black tea, things like that. And they didn't see the same effect. It was only popping up with coffee. So sorry to be a disappointment, but we don't know why this is happening. But it does happen for a minority of people. So it is something to look at if you do see that profile and you are a habitual coffee drinker.
So there are probably some people that are genetically predisposed, perhaps, to have this change in their triglyceride panel that raises the triglycerides a little bit when they're drinking coffee, regardless of the caffeine.
I'm not actually sure that it's genetic. So we did have someone who did a steak-only challenge a couple years ago. And they were drinking coffee during that time, and their triglycerides exploded super high. I think it was above 300 even. And 500. Okay, so it was 500. And we actually had them retest it to see if they could replicate it. So they were eating the exact same thing as before, all that type of stuff, including the coffee, and it didn't happen.
Okay, so there's something going on here that we don't fully have figured out. I mean, anyone that listens to my stuff will know that I'm no fan of coffee, and so any opportunity that I get to bludgeon coffee or to insinuate that the polyphenols in coffee are not beneficial to humans, I take with reckless abandon.
Point all your hate towards Saladino. We do not have a position on coffee officially. I have to tell you, if there's any single thing that we've gotten so much pushback for, it's even just the suggestion that this coffee sensitivity not only exists, but that could affect some people's triglycerides. I have to tell you, I've really come to appreciate how much it's a religion for many people. Like, it's so strong. So I can't even imagine what it's got to be like as a doctor recommending that for people.
I will do a whole podcast on coffee when I can find the person to do it with and really go into it. But people will know that I'm not a fan of coffee for a variety of reasons: mold toxins, acrylamide, pesticides. I don't believe that the polyphenols in coffee or any of the plant molecules are beneficial, et cetera, et cetera. And clinically, this is observational data only, and there is a confirmation bias, but clinically, the vast majority of people that I have in my practice, patients, clients who stop coffee, invariably feel better from a variety of things. Better sleep, better deep sleep, better REM on the Oura rings. They feel better overall when they stop coffee. I've also had people say they look forward to it. It's a ritual. I think it's addictive. It's clearly addictive. There's something about the roasted flavor. That's a whole separate topic. I have a whole sort of theory around the roasting of foods and how it creates the cooking of foods and how it creates uniquely addictive compounds for humans. And I think that we just need to be aware of that. But we will not go down that rabbit hole now.
So
Siobhan
basically, you're saying just eat all your meat raw? That's the impression I'm getting.
I would never say that as a physician. I could never say that. But I do have concerns that cooking meat, cooking beans, coffee beans, cooking seeds could create compounds which affect our satiety and affect us in an addictive way. And we need to be aware of that.
Yeah, I'll be interested to hear more from you on that. But as far as the coffee people, I mean, there's a pretty simple thing to do, and it's what I would do if I were in that position, is go 2 weeks without drinking coffee, try not to kill your spouse during that time, and retest. And generally, if people do that, we see that if it is the coffee, their triglycerides will go down below 100, assuming they're, again, properly fasted during that time. And then you can make a decision based off of that information. Do I want to continue drinking it? Do I not? And that's kind of up to you, because we honestly don't know if this is detrimental or not. We don't have information on it.
Right. We're still postulating.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. I think that's a really good discussion of all the blood work. Let's pivot a little bit and talk about NHANES, Dave. This is a super exciting topic that I know you want to share about. Let's just start by telling people, we talked about this a little bit at the end of the last podcast that we did, but that's like ancient history. So much has happened in the last couple of months.
You're so right. I honestly, so much has happened. I honestly couldn't even tell you what we talked about as far as NHANES goes. So for those people who don't know, it's the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey.
So it's a large set of data.
Yes, and it may be the largest set of data that one could get access to right now, and it's through the CDC. And I think part of the reason it wasn't on my radar to even look for before is it's known for being a dietary survey, and it's actually got some points against it. There's a number of people who think that its survey value is not that strong. But what I didn't know was that they actually take a fairly decent comprehensive set of blood panels. And once I found that out, I got quite excited about it. And I'm fortunate to have hooked up with Tommy Wood, who you know all too well. And one evening a few months ago, he said, okay, now I don't want you to get too excited, but I think we might have the NHANES data set together. And I was like, I can't help it. I'm too excited. Finally, I got it in my hands, and I basically disappeared for a month from social media and everything else. I was just ruminating in this data. And I did something that I really want to advocate for strongly, which is I did simple linear regressions. I did not do extraordinary levels of adjusting. And in fact, I always wanted to do this. I always wanted to get a large data set, and then the adjustments I made, I wanted to make one at a time. And what would be really neat, because I'd always want somebody else to do this for me, is to walk an audience through it visually. And that's what I've done in now 3 presentations. Basically, I say, look, this is the NHANES data. All the adjustments I've made, I put onto a single slide. And I can tell you what they are right now. I just took everybody who was eligible, I subtracted everybody who had any missing lipid data, which was just a small number.
How big is the study? How many people are we talking about here, Dave?
We're talking of the eligible number, there are 42,590.
42,000 people in this study.
Right.
Okay.
And, well, that were eligible.
That were eligible.
There's a number of people below 18 who are not eligible to be studied.
Okay.
Effectively.
Okay.
Then I removed everybody who didn't have triglycerides or total cholesterol or HDL. That leaves us with 40,444.
So we're looking at a pretty big data set.
Yes,
here.
yes.
40,000 people.
That's why I was so giddy.
Okay.
I was so excited.
And you said simple linear regression, which to me sounds like an oxymoron.
Well, here's the issue. You pull up almost any study at random that's about cholesterol. And what you're going to find in the methodology is they adjusted for. They did this, they did that, they made this change, they made that change. Oh, and now after all of these changes that are opaque that you can't easily look at for yourself, here's the final, and I would just call it a non-simple linear regression. It's now data that's been massaged to now finally have this final outcome that I don't know how much it resembles the data it came from. And that's a big problem I have, is because I feel like if you're making a claim of whatever outcome you're stating, you should be comfortable showing what the data looked like before you modified it.
So this is non-modified linear regression. But let's just tell me, what is linear regression? What are you doing here with this data? You're basically doing statistics, right? Like, what is linear regression?
It's like the most basic of basic statistics. Almost everybody who's listening to this has seen a version of a linear regression, which is effectively you're taking data and you're plotting two different variables, an independent variable and a dependent variable. So let's take height and weight, right? Those are two different variables. Let's find out how much height predicts weight. How do we do that? Well, we just take we take you in the room, we take me, we take Siobhan, we take everybody else, we take everybody in this hotel, and we collect both their height and their weight, and then we plot them on an X and a Y axis. And this is typically called a scatter plot. You're plotting each dot, it represents each person, but their position on that plot is it's how up you go is going to depend on the y-axis. How far to the right or left you go is going to depend on the x-axis. And once we do that, if there's a strong correlation, you'll see a kind of line of sorts that emerges from just the scatter of it. It looks like if you've seen the Milky Way galaxy, from planet Earth, and you're seeing that there's a lot of dots and they're all over the place, but you can kind of draw a line through it. That ends up being a line of regression. And that's neat because now you can kind of get a sense of how strong the relationship is.
So a linear regression is basically taking a scatter plot of data in two dimensions, an X and a Y axis, and trying to determine whether there's any relationship between those two variables that you're studying and drawing a line through it.
Right.
Okay.
And make no mistake, I am not a statistician. This is just the absolute basics. But here's the problem I have. The problem I have is, while many people might say, hey, that's too simplistic, we want something more sophisticated. Oftentimes I point back at them and I go, that's not how you're presenting it to us. You're presenting us a linear regression. You're presenting us something that is supposed to be something we respond to. And indeed, it is. If we see that if we see the relationship of one thing going up and then this other thing goes up seemingly in response to it, such as risk, then we go, oh my gosh, I don't want to be to the right side of that axis because it seems like it just keeps going up and up and up and up. So I want to be over here to the left side of the axis. So we naturally connect to that. And my frustration is I feel like sometimes, and believe me, I can't emphasize enough that I respect what scientists are doing, but I do feel like sometimes studies seem like a fairly fancy advertisement. That really it's about a particular headline and a particular central graphic that's meant to be viral, but then once you dig into the methodology, it's extremely convoluted. And even if you try to get into the supplemental data and so forth, you find that there's really not a lot there to show what it was before it had gotten modified. So bringing it back to NHANES, I said, look, I want to do what all engineers want to do. We want to take it apart. We want to look under the hood. We want to get our hands dirty with the real thing. And yeah, I want to apply my very basic statistical application to what it is I kept getting presented this whole time because I kept seeing these graphs being made for us. Now I wanted to do it. And that's what I did. And let me emphasize, I was always interested not so much in just cardiovascular disease with LDL. I wanted to see all-cause mortality.
Why?
Because I've believed for some time, early on in the research, that there is something more to just looking at LDL than its association with cardiovascular disease. Because if you're looking at just the dying of one thing, it doesn't tell you enough. You need to see the death by all things together. Because the assumption, if you lower LDL, it's beneficial, assumes there's nothing beneficial about LDL at all.
Exactly, which we're going to talk about a little later with Siobhan, talking about the benefits of LDL in the human body, immunologic benefits. We're going to talk about that. But I love that you're saying that if we're only focused on cardiovascular disease as an endpoint, we are really neglecting the possibility that LDL could have benefits elsewhere.
Right. And what's the clue? The clue is mortality itself.
Exactly. Because if we lower LDL and we see a benefit in cardiovascular disease, then and we blind ourselves to potential detriments or decreased or worsened outcomes in all-cause mortality, what have we really gained?
Well, and that's why I want to even correct the way that you stated that. You're saying a benefit in cardiovascular disease. Technically, a better way of stating it is if you lower your LDL, you're going to die more of something that is not cardiovascular disease. That's the better way of putting it.
Right.
That's only determining the what you die of. What I care about is the when you die.
When you die, how well you live, which is harder to look in statistics, but that's essentially what people care about.
And it's definitely what I care about.
That's what I care about too. I'm going to be surfing a long time, bro.
So NHANES, here's the gist. We have 40,444. What happens when we look at it stratified, when we stratify LDL into different groupings, and we actually look at it against longevity, particularly all-cause mortality? And I can tell you, if you take the NHANES data as it stands right now, and you stratify it, you're going to find on the left side, those people who have lower LDL will have lower all-cause mortality. Those people on the right side will have higher all-cause mortality. So we can go ahead and pack up this podcast. I've just now told you.
Lower LDL. Lower mortality.
all-cause mortality.
We're done. Let's go get a beer.
Right.
Except neither of us probably drinks beer.
But sure enough, as I then further looked at age parity, we don't have age parity. If you divide people by their LDL, you're going to find, unsurprisingly, because this is somewhat known, that generally speaking, people who are younger will generally have lower LDL. Those people who are older generally have higher LDL. In other words, typically as you get older, your LDL typically increases. Again, I say typically, it's a generality. It's not in all cases. Okay, so then we need to get to age parity.
Because age tends to be a risk factor for death, doesn't it?
That's right. Don't you love that line?
It's a great line.
I've said that in each of the, it's probably the biggest laugh I get out of that presentation, but yes.
I stole your joke.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So yes, once we get age parity, such as taking everybody who's age 50 and above, we get an age parity because the average in each group is around age 68.
So by age parity, you mean that when we look at all the people in the NHANES group who are above age 50, we can stratify them by different levels of LDL and basically have the same average age in every group.
Exactly.
Okay.
And once we have that and we know we have age parity, then we know we're comparing apples to apples. And right then I got something that was just jaw-dropping. And that was that, in fact, those people with the lowest LDL were dying at a higher rate per year, if you average and divide, than those with the higher LDL. Everybody who had an LDL of, say, 0 to 79 was dying at a rate of about 3.1% per year. Everybody 80 to 99 was dying at a rate of about 2.56%. So basically 2.5% per year. And everybody above 100 was dying at a rate of around 2% per year.
So everybody above 100 milligrams per deciliter of LDL in the age parity cohort in NHANES was dying at the lowest rate.
Compared to the lower rate of LDL. Correct.
Right. They were dying at a lower rate compared to the rate of death in somebody with a higher LDL. Or somebody with a lower LDL, excuse me. Yes. So this is completely counterculture, right? So this was where you did the Dave dance. And I want to see the Dave dance. We have a video of this, but I want to see the Dave. I want to know, like, what did you do when that happened? Like, what does Dave do when he gets so excited? Did you do like a fist pump in the air? Did you
Well, I honestly, as I was staring at it, I was just kind of in shock. Because to be sure, until you really have your hands in the data itself, again, I like to go get it for myself. Until I actually had it in my hands, I was really looking at the screen. I just kept staring at it. And I think this is also sort of an engineering thing. I kept thinking, I must have done something wrong here. Because I've always been interested in getting this data to look at the triad in particular.
The triad being?
The triad being not just high LDL, but high HDL and low triglycerides. That I didn't think LDL all by itself would be so associated with lower all-cause mortality. That I was not expecting at this magnitude. This is a fairly substantial magnitude, right? 1% per year. That's like a fairly big deal to say, well, at this lower level. Now, let me back up one step. Because the other thing you want to bear in mind is the concept of reverse causality. There's going to be some people who will say, and it's fair to explore this, some diseases are going to bring down your LDL.
Exactly. This is the main criticism here.
Correct. So some cancers, for example, many other things that can result in, say, organ shutdown, those are things that you need to be mindful of, could bring LDL down. And therefore, if you're, let's say, Paul, you've got one of these diseases and you're, 5 months away from dying, but you got your blood panel, it includes lower LDL cholesterol, well, now that's getting associated with your higher mortality along with everybody else. So that's why I went a step further and also did some further NHANES analysis where I actually excluded everybody who had died within 5 years of when they had their lipid panel taken.
So you tried to get rid of people who might have been sick
close to the time that their panel was taken.
Was drawn. There's a large body of literature that suggests that in the elderly population, a higher LDL is protective, right?
That's correct.
And people have criticized that body of literature for this reason exactly, saying that, hey, when you're getting older, a lower LDL, this is reverse causality. The people with low LDL are dying more, not because LDL is protective or LDL is not harmful, but because the people with low LDL, you're seeing cancers. But many of the researchers in that space have gone and done the same sort of thing. They've shown that the association holds even when they remove people who may have died, I think even within 1 or 2 years of the study data. And this is in the Leiden birth cohort and a couple of other things that I know Nadir Ali has talked about. You're saying 4 years they excluded, Siobhan is saying 4 years they excluded people. So it's interesting to see that this has been looked at and this criticism has been addressed, and that at least in the elderly population, it still holds true that the people with the highest LDL have the best outcomes. But you did the same thing in this, because we're not even necessarily looking at elderly people here, but you excluded people who died within 5 years.
Correct, but I've also looked specifically at elderly people.
Right.
Yeah, in fact, because I have the data in front of me right now, one of the more fascinating ones that I saw was I excluded for 5 years. We still saw a greater longevity with those people who had a higher LDL relative to lower LDL.
So the pattern stayed the same when you exclude those people that might have died within 5 years.
I'm going to be fair and say it's not so much exactly the same, because now the population's gotten smaller. So there's a little more, it's not as clean because there's not as many people in each of the groupings. But I also further did it at 10 years. And at 10 years, this actually I haven't revealed in any podcast or presentation up until this point. But even at 10 years, you had the greatest survival rate for those people with an LDL of 200 or higher.
What do you mean by 10 years? You're excluding people who died within 10 years?
Within 10 years of having their lipid panel taken. So basically, rate of death, excluding everybody who died within 10 years of having their lipids taken, it was, I mean, you could almost call it prognostic, except that, of course, it is observational. So we always caveat that this is epidemiological data. But as I said in my presentation, as I'll say to you now, epidemiology may not be good for proving causation, 100% acknowledged, but it's definitely very good at knocking down claims of causation. So if right now I was to tell you, Paul, I've been looking at everybody age 95 and above that survived in the NHANES data, and they're all 2-pack-a-day smokers, that would make no sense to you at all, right?
No sense. What? How's it possible? Maybe smoking is good for you.
Well, you would start to have to question everything you've come to understand about smoking.
Right.
Part of why it is that we're as confident as we are about smoking is because it actually does meet what was the original Bradford Hill criteria. And virtually across every major data set, you do find greater all-cause mortality, not just lung cancer, all-cause mortality with greater use of smoking. And not by like the little hazard ratios of like, say, 1.3 and so forth. We're talking, 200, 400%. I mean, 2,000, 4,000%, I believe. It's really way up there. You're not going to find a data set. In Hanes, if it tracks smoking, and I believe it probably does, I'll bet if I look, I'm not going to find a lot of centenarians who've been smoking.
Exactly. Right. So that one, yeah, pretty clear.
So in that sense, if we switch that around with LDL, how can we explain why people who had their lipids taken a decade earlier would still be clocking in more than those people who had the lower lipids from a decade earlier?
So you're saying when you excluded people who died within 10 years, the correlation still held that the people with the highest LDL had the best all-cause mortality.
Yes, the lowest all-cause mortality.
The most favorable, the lowest, yes. They were still kicking around. They were still surfing.
Right. Now, I want to kind of unpack this with Siobhan now, because why isn't it that at least lowering LDL wouldn't take out the whole cardiovascular disease section so that there wouldn't just be, that we couldn't count on a better longevity? Mm-hmm. And that's because there are potential benefits to LDL that need to be explored.
Right. Before you do that, Dave, let's just clarify this one thing for people. When you did this simple linear regression on the NHANES data and you got the age parity subset, because we started with 40,000 that were eligible, how many people ended up in the age parity subset?
Okay, so actually I probably can tell you that by just looking here. So sorry, I didn't have the mic near me when I said that. Okay, so let me repeat what I just said. Okay, so I'm actually now looking at the graph for those people above 50, and I have over here a chart. So I'm going to do kind of an estimate of sorts. And it looks as if I have around, I want to say around 20,000.
So we're still looking at 20,000 people
above age 50 that are in the enhanced data.
So I just want people to understand that we're not like making this a really small data set now. It's still a pretty big chunk of data.
No, quite the contrary. In fact, this was spread out a bit more before I moved into 6 groupings. When you spread it out a bit more, it loses a little bit of its power at each tail because, of course, there's less on each of the extremes. But even when you spread it out further in that way, you see that those people at the furthest of the right end of the tail on this linear regression look even better. But there's less confidence in that because, of course, there's less total in the number.
Right.
But let me read off these 6 numbers for each of the groupings. There was 1,611 in the first one. Then 2,724 in the first one was 0 through 79 LDL. Then 80 to 99 had 2,724. Then 100 to 119 or 4,123. And then it goes all the way up. Even the ones who were LDL of 160 to 1,000 is still 2,869. So a decent cohort comparison.
Great. Siobhan, how can we explain this? How could LDL possibly be good for, how could this be true?
I mean, one aspect of it is actually something that Dave had put me on when we had first met in person. He had mentioned it in passing, and he said a sentence that ultimately ended with, and we know that LDL can directly bind to pathogens. And I sat there for a second and was like, excuse me, what? It can do what now? And this is actually something that I've kind of obsessively looked into, chatting back and forth with Dave and just keep reading study upon study upon study upon this. And yeah, it's true. LDL can directly bind to pathogens, but more than that, it's
pathogens
heavily
being infectious organisms in the body.
Viruses, bacteria, even some parasites, it can bind directly to them, and that essentially neutralizes them. So they can't harm us anymore at that point, but they'll still be cleared by our immune cells. And not only that, it can bind to endotoxins. So parts of the bacteria that will trigger our immune system, it will bind to it and neutralize it. And the endotoxin, if it's high enough, can actually lead to things like sepsis, which can kill you. And there have been mouse studies where they look at mice with normal LDL levels versus high LDL levels, and they inject them with endotoxin. And the mice with high LDL levels will survive much more. And they've repeated this with things like salmonella, where the death rate was just astounding. In 5% versus 100%. Yeah, it was 5% mortality in the high LDL levels, and then 100% mortality in the normal levels.
In the mice.
In the mice.
And the hyperlipidemic ones that had 100% survival.
It might have been the other way around, but regardless, it was not insignificant.
There was a real difference. So that in the mice, when they inoculated the mice with this infectious bacteria salmonella, the mice that had higher levels of LDL seemed to have much better survival.
Much
better. Versus 100, 5% died versus 100% died in the group with the regular or low LDL.
Right. And they actually found that was because the high LDL levels were directly blocking the ability of salmonella to invade the organs. So, that's just one aspect of it, but it reaches across this far spectrum of not only binding to pathogens, binding to endotoxins, but also blocking entry of some bacteria or viruses into our cells, which is where they can do real damage. And it's just endless. And there's even a paper that says that LDL can neutralize reactive oxygen species during infection, and this can protect our own cells. Because one thing that we have to do during an infection in a lot of cases is we have to kill this bacteria or virus. We just have to. We cannot keep it there. And one way our immune cells can do that is they can essentially just barrage it with these oxidative particles in an attempt to kill it. But obviously that may result in some collateral damage, but the paper essentially suggested, LDL can take some of that damage and then we can just clear it and be done with it. And our own cells are spared in that case. So this may be part of the reason that we see this association, and it is an association, so we don't know for sure, what this is saying. But I think the benefit of LDL in the immune system is something I don't really see talked about often at all.
It sounds like the correlation is there, and we can't infer causality regarding the elevated LDL and the improved outcomes. But a lot of these things are mechanistically elucidated, that LDL mechanistically does these things with the immune system. So that's not just correlative. There's actual mechanistic data that LDL is beneficial in that way in the human body.
Yes, and I think another aspect of why high LDL may be associated with bad outcomes in a way is because if we do have these challenge events, we'll upregulate it in response. Just like we have a need for inflammation when we're injured, we can also upregulate LDL through this inflammatory signaling. And it may be because in some aspects it may be beneficial.
So in some ways, LDL could potentially be considered an acute phase reactant as well.
Yes, and a tip off to this going on is generally if there's an immune response going on, if LDL is high for these, in these bad situations, triglycerides will be high, HDL will be low, and inflammatory markers will be high. So that's something I always keep an eye on in my own results is, how's my insulin sensitivity? Because infection or other challenge events can cause insulin resistance. And how's my HDL doing, triglycerides, all of that. It has to be taken in context.
So what we're really developing here is this pretty elegant web of interconnection between all these inflammatory markers. And we're looking at fasting insulin, HDL, LDL, triglycerides, HSCRP, ferritin. And what we're seeing is this incredibly orchestrated system in the body that normally deals with infections, or can be dealing with infections. And what you said there is quite striking. And I think that you, maybe in the Keto Salt Lake talk that you were showing me, or the Low Carb Salt Lake talk, there is evidence that in a state of infectious burden in a human, VLDL and LDL can be upregulated. That we can actually, just like we're going to see an increase in the white blood cell count, we can see an increase in LDL when someone has an infection. That's true? That's been documented.
Yeah, and I've even seen this in my own results. Every single time I get sick, I go get lab work and my LDL particle count will be higher and triglycerides will generally be higher, HSCRP higher, HDL lower, like all of this. This profile will emerge. And I want to expand a little bit. This isn't just infection, because our immune system deals with a lot of stuff, and part of that is infection, but part of it is also, if we get an injury, if we get sunburned, if we are dealing with something like that, dealing with damage or a need for repair, this will start to show up where we'll see this profile, and that's all immune system involvement.
So there's almost an evolutionary role for insulin resistance here.
I would say so. And even beyond injury and infection in the immune system, I can say with some guarantee that your muscles are insulin resistant right now. And if they weren't, they would be eating up all the glucose and leaving none for your brain, and you would be dead.
But I do think it's interesting to note that humans physiologically become insulin resistant when they have an infection.
Correct.
Probably for many of these reasons. And because I think that one of the things I've talked about on a lot of podcasts, and you guys have noted, Amber O'Hearn has noted very wisely as well, is that insulin resistance seems to be the thing that we always talk about. It often comes back to insulin resistance. And people would say, well, wow, where's it all coming from? But there is this interesting evolutionary advantage to being insulin resistant during certain times. And one of those is infection. And so it seems that what's happening with a lot of chronic disease now is that we're becoming insulin resistant inappropriately. We're getting inflammation inappropriately, but inflammation and insulin resistance go hand in hand from an evolutionary perspective because our body wants all of this to happen. And perhaps we could even then take it a step further and say evolutionarily, when we get inflammation, when we're trying to fight a pathogen, it makes sense that inflammation would trigger insulin resistance for all of these reasons.
Correct, but I would push back a little bit on that and say it may not be inappropriate. We may actually be needing it.
That's completely appropriate in that situation. Yes.
Exactly.
And what I'm trying to tie together is the fact that in other situations where we're getting inflammation, that could also trigger insulin resistance when there's not a pathogen, right?
Correct.
And those are the pathologic situations that we see with metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and all these other things, these other chronic conditions, right?
Right. I mean, look, let's cut to the chase.
Cut to the chase, Dave.
Until you know the root cause.
Yeah.
You're looking at existing mechanisms in the body that we were built to have. Now, the context is something new. How do we actually end up in a state with just chronic inflammation and hyperinsulinemia that goes on for months, years? When has that really existed before ancestrally? And I mean, to the best of our knowledge, we've not really had something like this until recently. So certainly we have lots of suspects as far as the environment and diet and so forth. But to the extent to where this has been something that we know was built into our body, I feel like we have more than enough data that's in the literature that shows that this is the case. And I mean, there's still part of my frustration is, and Siobhan had kind of spoken to this as well, things like the antioxidant effect. I got into a rabbit hole with alpha tocopherol, which is, of course, vitamin E found on board LDL particles. Because for the longest time, I kept reading the literature. This was the antioxidants were on board LDL particles to protect itself until it ran out. And then when it ran out, then it was in big trouble. And more, I kept saying, now, wait a sec, it actually extends through the monolayer of the LDL particle. If I've got a lot of these and they're throughout my vascular system, why wouldn't I call it part of the antioxidant defense system? And what I'm using this as an illustration of is that we're not even thinking in the direction yet, because we're starting from the assumption that LDL particles are themselves pathogenic and we're the source of the problem, right? And so the big change isn't just saying, hey, we need to start looking for the root cause. It's to start recognizing that many things we're taking as the root cause may not be the root cause. And that's already a big paradigm shift, but it shouldn't be. We should already be seeing these things that are coming up from our body that if we go to indigenous populations are not a problem. And then once these indigenous populations are brought into our diet, into our lifestyle and so forth, we see the problem to say, okay, well, clearly this wasn't an issue for them before. And they have so many things that are in common with us in spite of these genetic differences. Maybe we should start looking a little bit more at what changed.
What are you thinking of specifically here?
As far as what changed?
As far as things that might be triggering, these underlying triggers that you were referring to?
Oh, well, actually, this is a good time to pass it.
So I think a big hint is, the Virta data that's been coming out. They change their diet, and all this stuff starts to resolve. We see diabetes going into remission. We see their inflammation markers going down. Their LDL-C turns to a more, less small, dense particles, more large particles, which is another aspect of that profile that we see. And all of this stuff starts to resolve. So I think the big hint is it may be something in our diet. What that is, up for debate. I don't think we fully know. But at the very least, it's something that changes when those people in the Virta program change their diet.
And in people in the Virta program, for those that are not familiar, are generally doing ketogenic diets.
Correct.
Virta is a program that's Steve Finney and Jeff Volek, and it gets people on ketogenic diets. And so in that data, yes, they're finding some striking results that people, when they go onto these ketogenic diets, when they adjust their metabolism, they adjust their macronutrient ratios to achieve ketosis, they're finding these improvements.
Correct. And this is not only diabetes, this is also non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And we're starting to see more research looking at even things like MS or like all this other stuff. We see some improvements on ketogenic diets, or at least suggestions of improvements. And you could argue over whether that's the ketones in itself or the environment that promotes ketogenesis or something you've removed from the diet.
Actually, and I can't help it. I've got to pitch, even though I shouldn't be the one doing this, but I've got to pitch Carnivore here. Carnivore, of course, you guys are both carnivore. I still have some plants now and then, but Carnivore has been such a success as a multiple removal diet.
Absolutely.
That in many ways, it helps to seem to make this case almost stronger than almost any other diet as far as diet being the root cause. Because I've definitely come into knowing more and more people who have ultimately found that out of necessity. I think of carnivore sometimes as one of the most evidentiary movements there are, because almost nobody says, what sounds like a great idea? I want to have just only animal products and nothing else at all in my diet. And it isn't to say that you can't enjoy it and love it, because many people eventually do, and then they have a great time. But you don't naturally come to that conclusion, particularly in an environment we've only heard that plants are the most appropriate place to get your nutrition. So it's only many people I know who've done carnivore. Michaela Peterson is, of course, one of the most famous examples. They've tried like every single thing else there is. It really was like at the very end of the line. And that actually says quite a lot towards the question of root cause.
Yeah, the elimination is so powerful. I think that if people want to know what's causing their illness, they should fast. And they should, you probably want to be ketogenic or keto adapted or fat adapted before you do a fast, or you will suffer greatly. You will not die. But so many people get improvements with fasting. And I think, like you said, that suggests strongly it is what you're eating, or eating is a huge trigger. And once Western medicine realizes that, we have a powerful tool. Now, then the question becomes, what is it that you're eating that's triggering you? And therein lies all of this sort of examination that we're trying to do and help people clarify. And I accept that for some people, a carnivore diet may not be the best thing or the easiest thing or the panacea, but I think for a lot of people, it can be incredibly powerful.
I agree. And I think carnivore improving on top of ketogenic diets is a big hint that it's not just ketones, although they may contribute. It is something else. It could be something we're removing, or even removal plus addition of quality protein, quality fat, things that we may need in that state. And, it requires more investigation is the long and short answer, because we just don't know.
Yeah, those stories of people doing better on carnivore relative to keto are interesting to me. There are thousands of people that are doing fantastically on keto, and there are, stories of people doing even better on carnivore. So that's an interesting set of anecdotes.
To be sure, I can definitely add to this. The one thing that I give carnivore over keto is there's a lot of different ways to do keto that are not really keto. A lot of people that I believe think they are keto are not really keto.
Exactly. If they measured ketones, they would not have them in their blood.
And so it's hard to mishit carnivore.
Yeah.
Unless you're going out and you're having, ribs with barbecue sauce, pretty much if you're eating just meat, eggs, even cheese to some extent, depending on your tolerance levels, you probably are nearly zero carb, or at least, well under 10, right? And that's, again, you're not going to have like sweetened meat treats.
Right.
Unless something was added.
You're not going to have sneaky plants in your diet if you're trying to be a carnivore.
Right. You don't have to read as many labels. That's for sure.
Yeah. Siobhan, you said something earlier that I want to return to because we were talking about this before we started podcasting. In your recent talk, and this kind of segues from the idea of reactive oxygen species and free radicals and oxidative stress, and the idea that within mainstream thought, these are considered to be the worst thing in the world. And you've pointed out, I think very wisely, that our body uses these in inflammatory processes to fight pathogens. We use reactive oxygen species as signaling molecules. We use reactive oxygen species for positive processes. I don't know that positive is the right word there, but we use them for intentional processes for productive means in the human body to fight infections. So there were a series of studies that you mentioned in which they were trying to use antioxidants that didn't really work that well. Can you tell me about these? When we try and muck around with this system, this delicate balance of reactive oxygen species in our body, it doesn't always go so well, does it?
Yeah, and you'll see this talked about as if there's an imbalance in oxidants versus antioxidants. And that's actually one of the definitions that they use for oxidative stress. It's this unbalancing, as if we've, stumbled and tipped something we shouldn't have, and we just have to correct it ourselves. But one thing I think can be easily missed is this unbalancing may be happening for a reason, because we do use oxidative stress to help promote cell growth in the muscle after exercise, for example, or even to promote healing and fight pathogens and all this stuff. And so there have been a couple attempts to use, for example, vitamin C and vitamin E to prevent cardiovascular disease or improve mortality. And again, they've shown it just doesn't work. Either it does nothing at best, or it actually ends up with higher mortality in the people taking the antioxidant supplements. I mean, what more do you even say to that?
That's striking. That's a striking finding that people are taking antioxidant supplements and they have worse mortality. That's incredible. And I hear this all the time. People cannot get Linus Pauling out of their heads. They are so enamored with vitamin C as the superest of super vitamins. And I think I'm not convinced by any of the evidence for that. I wish it were true, but it's just not out there.
Yeah, I don't think it's that simple. It's just, and I believe he was actually the person who suggested that high lipoprotein(a) is subclinical scurvy, so not enough vitamin C. And the way he went about that was he ended up giving rats subclinical scurvy, and these rats were messed up in all sorts of ways. Rats don't make lipoprotein(a). And not only that, but if you make them able to, you have to also make them able to make human ApoB, because it won't connect. So they have to have human LDL. They have to be able to make lipoprotein(a). It's a mess. And you also have to inhibit their ability to synthesize vitamin C because they naturally can, and you have to take that away. And what ended up happening is they developed subclinical scurvy. So their arteries started to just dissolve, and their lipoprotein(a) went up.
So after these three genetic changes, after these three genetic changes that they made to this species, it turned out it had a problem. That's what I'm hearing from this study.
Yeah, Frankenmice are not the best study cohort. Well, this is a good segue. Let's talk about Lp(a) as we round out this amazing podcast. I mean, this is one that's full of gems, but Lp(a) was also one of the things that you guys tested on this blood panel here. So, Siobhan, I know you've done some really cool articles recently on cholesterol code about Lp(a). Let's talk a little bit about Lp(a) and help demystify this for people, because it's a confusing topic.
Right. And so to follow up with the mouse study, the Frankenstein mice, what ended up happening is there was more lipoprotein(a) in the rats with dissolving, deteriorating arteries. And it's like, okay, slam dunk. So we just have to hypersupplement vitamin C and all will be good and our arteries will be protected. But then you actually start looking at what lipoprotein(a) is used for. And one of those uses is wound healing. So you've given these rats this subclinical scurvy, their arteries are damaged, and then they end up with lipoprotein(a) there. Well, why is that? If you look at tissue samples and look to see where the lipoprotein(a) is, it's in wounded tissue. You won't find it in healthy tissue. And so it's no wonder you've wounded their arteries, lipoprotein(a) goes there as part of the healing response. okay, that's a bit more complicated.
So you're saying that lipoprotein little a has some valuable roles, just like LDL, because
Yes.
LP little a, and we should define what LP little a is for people that don't know, but LP little a is much maligned as well. People say, oh, this is the worst thing of the worst.
Yeah. And so essentially a good way to sum it up is it looks very similar to an LDL particle, so those boats, but it has an extra attachment to it. It has an extra protein on it. And that protein is apo(a). So all the apos, they do different things, they signal different things. And this apo(a) allows it to do things like help with wound repair, help with clotting, things like that. And another aspect of it is it will collect oxidized parts of lipoproteins or cells, and it has enzymes that will break those down and pass off those byproducts to albumin so they can be dumped. So it does have different uses that are probably quite helpful. But the problem is, if you look at high lipoprotein a, it's associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So we need it low, the end. But it's not that simple. It's not that simple because if you start looking at other contexts, so there are markers like LP-PLA2, which is it's a marker found on lipoproteins that break down oxidative parts on there. And if it's high, above 700, with high LP(a), you're in trouble. That's high risk. But then if you look at below 700, there's no increased risk, no significant increased risk of high LP(a) in that context. And for reference, most of the people on low-carb diets that I've seen have LP-PLA2 around, like 200, 250. So it's nowhere close.
And what we're talking about here are two things that sound a lot alike. We're talking about LP(a) and LP-PLA2, right? So I don't want people to get confused. And what I think you and I have talked about, Dave, is that LP-PLA2 basically tracks with LDLP. So that LP-PLA2, or maybe Tom Dayspring told me that there's a correlation between LP-PLA2 and LDL particle number.
I wouldn't be surprised by that. To be sure, I don't want to speak to that until I've checked enough with my own data, but I would actually expect that. And I would expect, for example, somebody who goes low carb, high fat over to carb centric, that their LP-PLA2 goes down. But again, this kind of comes back around to lipolytic activity overall.
That is actually something I've seen in my data because I have tracked it while fasting, while doing the protocol, and it does track with LDLP. But from the studies that we have, it doesn't even get anywhere close to that cutoff where the high risk is. And it's not only that, it's also HDL levels. There was a study looking at middle-aged men. They already had coronary artery disease, fairly sick people, but the men with high HDL, no increased risk from LP(a). So again, context is key. And there are others looking at Framingham risk score and other things like that. And again, once you look at different contexts of metabolically healthy people not in these challenge states all the time, you start to see that risk kind of disappear into thin air.
And you mentioned that you've been able to affect your LP(a) level quite substantially, because this is the other thing that I was taught, and many people will discuss, is that it's very hard to change LP(a), but you've seen different results.
Yes, and that's what I've heard in the literature. You have this genetic baseline that can vary quite a lot, and I do think that is true. Dave's levels, for example, are 2 nanomoles per liter, and mine are generally around 130. So there's quite a significant difference there. And I have had my parents tested, and I do think it's coming from one of my parents. So there is that genetic baseline, but then what you'll also hear in the literature is you can't really change it with lifestyle. Really, the only thing you can do is take things like niacin to lower it a little bit, but not a lot. But I started tracking lipoprotein(a) through the course of my experiments, just add it on, see what happens. I didn't really expect to see anything. But then what ended up happening was I did a experiment involving 7 days of fasting and then 5 days of high calorie, high fat ketogenic fare. And I got the results back and I was confused. I was like, no, there must be some sort of mistake, because what ended up happening is during the fast, LP(a) went up in tandem with LDL. And when I was doing the high calorie, high fat feasting, Lp(a) dropped like a rock. It went from around 140, I think, 150, and then to around 60 or so.
So that's a profound change in Lp(a) nanomoles per liter.
Correct. That would be considered significant in the literature. And it was like, all right, I guess I have to keep testing it now. Let's see what happens. And I ended up actually repeating the same thing because there was some speculation on Dave and I's part. Maybe it's the fasting that did something that lowered it, maybe. So I ended up doing another experiment coming from baseline calories and then hypercaloric, so high calorie, high fat, ketogenic fare again. And then it dropped again, this time even lower, because during that time I was eating around 4,000 to 6,000 calories a day for 5 days. And it dropped again, and this time it was in the 50s, coming from, again, around 130. So it was consistent. And I just kept testing. So I've done pork versus beef, and everyone tends to freak out about this one because it's like, oh, so eating pork, your Lp(a) is higher, so I'll never touch pork again. And it's like, okay, so we don't know why this is happening yet. And there is some literature to suggest L-carnitine can lower Lp(a). So it could be that coming from all pork carnivore to all beef carnivore, L-carnitine levels are higher, and that may be why there's a drop. I don't think we know yet. And it's worth mentioning that the other inflammatory markers, I didn't really notice a significant difference. So it could be something else affecting it. But regardless, it was affected by diet. So, I can pretty reliably move it around at this point. And this most recent experiment was the true test of this, where I was like, okay, I've got to see if it's following the inversion pattern, like all the way through. And one experiment that Dave had done that I hadn't yet was a high carb, low fat diet. So you're relying more on glucose, less on fat. So LDL should drop down. And if it's true that Lp(a) is following that, then it should drop as well. So I ended up doing that, and short story, it sucked. But I don't have the results in yet, so you'll have to wait.
We'll break them when you get them.
Can I bring this around to a very important central point that really needs to be emphasized? So as Siobhan just said, she has more sick data than I do. I'm kind of jealous of that because I've not been sick for 4 years since going keto. It's the longest stretch ever. I keep waiting for me to get something bacterial or infectious or something, but a lot of lean mass hyperresponders state this as well. There's just a lot less sickness that's immune response related. I don't think it's a coincidence. But that said, Siobhan has data in both camps. You have data both on the metabolic side affecting these markers and on the illness side affecting these markers. So even if you didn't believe in low carb, even if you were just like passing by this podcast and wanted to take away one thing, I would like you to take away this one, which is that clearly there are two ways in which these markers are getting changed, yet they're being interpreted in one way.
Yes, I couldn't agree more.
That has to be known.
And what you're saying there, Dave, is that we can affect these markers with metabolic changes, that is diet and inflammation.
Correct.
And that what is happening is that people are conflating changes in the markers with inflammation and diet, and we're mixing those up. And there's a little bit of nuance there, and I can talk about that more in podcasts, but this is something I've talked about in the past with you and with Nadir Ali with regard to LDL. We have to decide, is this a change in LDL that's related to diet, like a carnivore or ketogenic diet, or is this a change in LDL that's related to inflammation? And what does that mean, and what's the context?
Right. And this is why I tend to try and look at the big picture. So what are all of the markers? What story are they telling? Are inflammation markers high or are they low? What's the HDL, the triglycerides, the insulin, all of it? And what story does that tell you? Because they look very different. And there was another study actually that kind of lends more to this idea that the context is very important for lipoprotein(a). And that was a study saying that serially increasing lipoprotein(a) levels led to significantly higher risk of cardiovascular disease. And they were tracking other markers too. And the only thing it really came back to that it was tracking with was CRP, which is an inflammatory marker, as we've said.
There are so many markers like this, I think, that get confusing for people. TMAO, LP little a. And I think what we're going to find is that it's just that they can be linked to diet or they can be linked to inflammation and insulin resistance. And never the twain shall meet. And those are not the same thing. And it is not the marker itself that confers the risk, but it is what's causing it to move that can confer the benefit. In the case of TMAO, as I've talked about in the past, there's recent data to suggest that reverse causality is probably what's going on there. And it's not the TMAO that's toxic. It's the insulin resistance that's causing the TMAO to be high. Yet everybody wants to blame TMAO. And maybe the same thing is true with LP little a, that we can affect LP little a with diet and with lifestyle or with genetics. There's a genetic component, but that doesn't mean that, it's the same as an LP little a that's elevated because of an inflammatory cause like a CRP thing. So that is the nuance that I think Western medicine will struggle with for so long, that context is everything. And I think what we're talking about here is the fact that ketogenic and carnivore diets change many of these markers in a way that could be interpreted as negative, when in fact, it's probably not the same as inflammation. You guys think I'm saying that right?
No, I think so. And for that matter, this is why we struggle, because oftentimes people will come to us and say, give us a Cliff's Notes. Give us like just one marker that you would really like want to pick on the most. And without question, if I had one marker, this goes all the way back to Ivor Cummins. He had a great video that I saw way back when I started my research, Cholesterol Conundrum. And he said if he could just track one marker, he would just track insulin. And I have to concede that if I could just track one marker, it'd be insulin. I'd be very miserable because, as you know, I like to track almost everything. But I'll say this about insulin. It has been surprisingly reliable in making this distinction towards something that especially is problematic in the context of being highly fasted. Like if you're fasted, as you said, 12 to 14 hours, and you're still seeing it very elevated, to me, that's saying something much deeper. And I don't know yet that I've ever seen even a state of illness where I've seen, like, say, insulin in the double digits. But of course, you've got more data than I do. Have you ever observed your insulin in the double digits from when you've been sick?
I'm not sure if I have. I think it's maybe gotten up to 10 at one point, and that's not usual for me. But yeah, I think that kind of speaks to the severity of what we're seeing just in the general population. And if I could nitpick one thing that you said it may not be the TMAO that's toxic, it may be the insulin resistance. I would argue it's not the insulin resistance either, although it could contribute to symptoms. It's what's causing the insulin resistance.
Exactly. And we're just tracing it back a little further. What turtle is the turtle standing on? It's turtles all the way down. But yes, I think that is the ultimate question that medicine in today's day and age is tasked with answering. And probably citizen scientists like you guys are going to be more at the forefront of doing this than anyone in the medical community. But like, what the heck is causing insulin resistance? And that can be different. There are probably multiple answers, but that is the most interesting question. And so thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, you guys, this has been a marathon. We dropped some bombs. Comic-Con was here a few weeks ago. I want to know what characters you guys would have been at Comic-Con. Siobhan, if you had gone to Comic-Con.
Probably Batman. I'm just that simple at heart.
You know what's funny is I was thinking you guys were kind of like Batman and Catwoman, but I didn't think Dave would be Catwoman. But Siobhan gets back. All right. Dave?
I'm a Spider-Man guy through and through. That's what I grew up with. It's,
Spider-Man.
Yeah,
all right.
Spider-Man. I hate to sound cliche, but childhood connection.
Spider-Man, I got it. I'd be Boba Fett. Ben, who would you be at Comic-Con?
Probably Iron Man.
Ben would be Iron Man. All right. Ben is one of my buddies helping me out with the video production here. All right, guys, this is the last question I'm asking everybody now. What is the most radical thing you've done in the last month?
Gosh. For me, unfortunately, it was thinking quite seriously about an experiment that I may in fact do. It's one I've already talked about before. Last year was a bit rough because I've already done a lot of experiments that put me kind of on the edge with a lot of carb swapping and carb additions and added sugar and so forth. And so I really meant to not do another one of those experiments in the near future, but I've come across a new hypothesis, which I talked about, which we'll get into in another podcast But effectively, I may want to induce a hyperinsulinemic state for, say, 3 to 4 days. And just thinking about it has been the most radical thing I've done in the last month.
I love your self-experimentation, man. Many props for that.
So it depends on your definition of radical.
That's what this whole podcast is about.
So radical as in completely not something I'd expect myself to do. The high carb experiment was definitely that. It's not something we touched on, but before I went keto, I dealt with depression that was kind of cleared up by changing the diet. And so adding carbs back in is not anything I wanted to mess with. Wasn't as bad as I expected, but it definitely was radical. Radical good. I took a bunch of people's blood, not directly, but we did collect it, and that was pretty cool.
That's awesome. You guys are legends.